He was the young son of one of the richest men in the country. Weak, sick, and growing up in silence inside a mansion where money solved everything except what really mattered. Everyone around him followed orders, kept their distance, and stuck to routines. That is, until the day a quiet butler came into his life. He didn't have much, no power, no title, but the boy saw something in him no one else had. One day, after a painful treatment, he made a simple request that shook him to the core. What he did after that moment didn't just change the boy's life. It forced his father to face a truth he had buried for years. When the truth came out, no one saw it coming. Not the doctors, not the staff, not even the billionaire himself. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We'd love to know that Reginald Harrington was one of the richest men in the country. Everything that money could buy, sports cars, a private jet, a mansion bigger than most hotels, but none of it mattered anymore. Since the death of his wife Harriet, life had lost all meaning. She died just weeks after giving birth to their son little Liam because of a fast and aggressive cancer that no one had managed to detect in time. Now Reginald lived in that same enormous house, but it felt empty. Every hallway echoed. The once warm home was now cold and silent. Every wall seemed to have a photo of Harriet smiling, and each one reminded him of what he had lost. He tried to keep busy by working harder and investing millions in medical research to fight the disease that took her away, but it never felt like enough. There was always something missing. He felt powerless, broken, and alone, even surrounded by wealth and success. Little Liam, his son, was now just a small boy, barely able to understand the world around him, but already facing a cruel reality. He had inherited not just his mother's eyes and her smile, but also the same disease that had killed her. Doctors discovered it early, but it was still serious. He had to go through constant treatments, medicines, tests, injections, day after day. The man in charge of these treatments was Dr. Harold Kensington, a well-known and respected physician with years of experience. He did his best to make little Liam feel safe and cared for, but the procedures were hard. Little Liam cried often. Sometimes he was too tired to play or even eat. He didn't understand why he was always in hospitals or why he felt so weak. His father, Reginald, stayed distant, watching from the background like a shadow. He wanted to be close, but something in him held him back. It was like he didn't know how to be a father anymore. The house they lived in was full of expensive furniture, tall glass windows, and quiet halls. Everything was perfectly tidy and organized, but it didn't feel alive. There was no laughter, no music, no warmth. The staff tried to keep things moving. Meals were served, rooms were tidied, and appointments were scheduled. But even they felt the sadness that hung in the air. Every room carried a memory of Harriet, and Reginald couldn't escape them. He would often stand for long minutes staring at her photos, remembering their life before everything fell apart. At night, he couldn't sleep. He would walk through the mansion in silence, stopping by little Liam's room just to watch him breathe. Sometimes he cried alone, quietly. The emptiness around him was louder than any sound. He had everything, but also nothing. Money couldn't fix what was broken, couldn't bring Harriet back. It couldn't cure little Liam. All he could do was keep watching, hoping something would change. Reginald thought that maybe by funding medical research, he could make some kind of difference. He donated to hospitals, sponsored labs, and paid for studies that tried to understand the kind of cancer Harriet had. He met with doctors and scientists, asked questions, and signed checks without hesitation. But every time he walked into the hospital where little Liam was treated, he felt helpless. He wasn't a doctor. He couldn't solve anything with his own hands. All he could do was wait and pay. It made him feel useless, like a bystander in his own life. Dr. Kensington kept him informed, always speaking clearly and with care, but the news was rarely good. The treatments were slowing the disease, but not curing it. Reginald started to fear that he might lose his son too, so that thought haunted him day and night. He didn't know how much more loss he could take. His mind kept replaying memories of Harriet and imagining a future without little Liam. Little Liam, despite everything, was a sweet and curious child. Even with the pain, he sometimes smiled. He liked drawing with crayons and watching birds through the window. Dr. Kensington tried to make his time during treatments as comfortable as possible, bringing toys and explaining things in a way little Liam could understand. But the truth was, He spent more time in hospital beds than in playgrounds. He missed out on what most children experienced. He rarely saw his father up close. Reginald would appear sometimes, watching quietly from a few feet away, but little Liam never felt his touch or heard words of comfort. The distance between them grew every day, even though they lived in the same house. The only thing connecting them was the sadness they both carried. One too young to understand it fully, the other too lost to know what to do with it. Hope seemed to be something only other people had. In the Harrington mansion, time moved slowly. Each day felt the same, quiet, heavy, and full of pain. Reginald sat alone in his office most hours, staring at reports and emails he barely read. The butler brought him food he didn't eat. Nurses came and went, checking on little Liam and updating Reginald, who nodded silently. Dr. Kensington did what he could, but even he felt the weight of the situation. He admired Reginald's strength, but also saw the fear in his eyes. Everyone in that house was waiting for news, for change, for something to break the pattern, but nothing came. Little Liam continued his treatments. Reginald continued to grieve and work. Harriet's memory lived on in every corner. Silence was deep, and the sadness stronger than anything else. In the Harrington home, there was no laughter, no comfort, and no joy. Only the distant hope that maybe one day things would be different. But for now, all they had was the emptiness. When the last group of caregivers left, Reginald Harrington was forced to find someone new to help with his son. The team had been professional but cold, focused only on treatments and schedules. There was no warmth in their presence. Reginald contacted an agency and asked for someone experienced, reliable, and calm. That was how Old Man Albert arrived at the Harrington mansion. He didn't speak much during the interview. He listened carefully, nodded gently, and agreed to start immediately. His presence was quiet, almost invisible at first. He wore simple clothes and moved through the house without making noise. Reginald barely looked at him, only explained what was needed and left. Old Man Albert didn't ask questions. He just observed and learned. He took his time understanding the house, the people, and most of all, little Liam. He didn't rush anything. He watched how the boy behaved, how the nurses worked, and how Reginald stayed away. The house was silent, but Old Man Albert was patient enough to wait for the right moment to act. Over the next days, Old Man Albert began taking on more responsibilities, but not just the tidying or serving. He started to sit in the corner of the room when little Liam had his treatments. He didn't speak unless spoken to. Sometimes he just hummed softly or told a short story in a low voice. Little Liam, who usually avoided eye contact, began to glance at him. At first it was just curiosity. Then slowly he started reacting to his presence. He didn't cry as much when he was near. Old Man Albert was careful not to overstep. He asked the nurses for permission before helping, and he never pushed little Liam to talk. One day he offered him a small toy after a long session. He didn't say anything, but he held it tightly. Reginald noticed these small moments. He watched from a distance and felt uncertain. He didn't like seeing someone else get close to his son, but at the same time he couldn't deny that little Liam looked a little better. Old Man Albert was changing something. Old Man Albert continued his calm and steady approach. He started reading books to little Liam at night. He chose simple ones full of colors and animals. At first, little Liam just listened with his eyes half closed. Then one night, he asked him to read one again. It was the first time he had made a request in weeks. Old Man Albert nodded and read it slowly, making sure to point at the pictures. Sometimes he sang softly when he was too tired. He also helped him with his physical therapy, encouraging him in small ways. "One more step," he would say, holding his hand firmly. Little Liam started responding more, gave short smiles, tried harder during exercises, and even whispered a few words to him. The nurses were surprised. Reginald watched this change with mixed feelings. He felt grateful, but also afraid. Harriet had been the last person to bring that kind of warmth into the house. Seeing Old Man Albert reach little Liam made him feel like he was losing something again, even though he didn't know exactly what. Reginald tried to keep his distance as he always had. He told himself that Old Man Albert was just doing his job and that it didn't mean anything more, but deep down he knew things were different. The house didn't feel as silent as before. Sometimes he heard Old Man Albert laughing gently with little Liam. He saw him sitting beside him, holding his hand during treatment. He didn't act like a nurse or a servant. He acted like someone who truly cared. Reginald didn't know how to feel about it, didn't interfere, but he also avoided being in the same room for too long. He feared that if he let himself feel again, the pain would return stronger. Old man Albert never asked for attention, kept his focus on little Liam. He didn't try to get involved in Reginald's life. The entire world, it seemed, became that boy in his recovery. The mansion still felt large and cold. Now it had one small place where something different was growing, a connection that hadn't existed before. One afternoon, after a difficult treatment that left little Liam exhausted and in pain, old man Albert stayed by his side. The room was quiet, the machine still beeping softly. He was wiping his forehead with a cloth when little Liam suddenly reached for his hand. His fingers were weak, but he held him tightly. He looked at him with tired eyes and said in a faint voice, "Albert, promise you'll save me." The words hit old man Albert like a wave, froze, unsure of what to say. His throat tightened, and he couldn't speak for a moment. He looked into his face and saw a mixture of fear, confusion, and hope. Old man Albert wasn't his father. He wasn't even family. But in that moment, he needed someone to believe in. So without thinking too much, he leaned closer, hugged him gently, and whispered, "I promise, I'll take care of you." He didn't fully understand what that promise meant, but he knew it was real. He meant it with all his heart. That moment stayed with old man Albert long after little Liam fell asleep. He sat in the chair beside his bed thinking about what he had said. It wasn't just a child's question. It was a plea. It was the deepest expression of trust he had ever given to anyone. He realized then that this wasn't just a job anymore. He had come to the Harrington mansion expecting to tidy, to serve, to help. Everything had changed. Little Liam needed him in a way no one else did. Reginald, though distant, had allowed him into their lives without knowing what it would lead to. That single request, "Promise you'll save me," had changed something in him. Old man Albert wasn't sure how he would keep that promise. He wasn't a doctor, and he couldn't stop the disease. But he could stay, care, and be the person little Liam needed. He had no idea how much this promise would affect his future, but he knew he would never forget that moment, or the boy who asked for hope. As the days went by, old man Albert started to notice small things that didn't seem right. It began with the medicine. Every time little Liam received a certain imported medication, his condition got worse instead of better. At first, he thought it was a coincidence. The doctor said side effects were normal, and little Liam's illness was complicated, but the pattern was too clear to ignore. Within a few hours after taking that specific drug, his skin would grow pale, his temperature would spike, and his breathing would become shallow. Old man Albert quietly wrote everything down in a small notebook he kept hidden in his vest pocket: times, doses, and reactions. He didn't tell anyone at first. He wanted to be sure before saying something that could cause trouble. Still, every time he saw the nurses prepare those injections, he felt a knot in his stomach. Something about it didn't make sense. Deep inside, he started to feel afraid that little Liam was being hurt instead of helped. Old man Albert began checking the medication labels more closely. The names printed on the boxes were complicated, but he noticed that some didn't match the doctor's prescriptions. The dosage listed on one bottle wasn't the same as what was written in little Liam's treatment file. Some containers had different serial numbers than the ones recorded on the charts. When he compared the leaflets, they seemed to describe similar drugs, but from different manufacturers. The paperwork looked messy and confusing, as if someone had replaced things on purpose. Old man Albert tried to bring up his concerns gently during conversations with the nurses. "Are you sure this is the right medication for today?" he asked one afternoon. The nurse just smiled stiffly and said, "It's all correct, Mr. Albert. Please, don't worry about that." But her tone was cold. Another time, old man Albert asked if Dr. Kensington had approved the changes, and the answer was quick. Of course, everything goes through him. Still, the answers felt rehearsed, and no one looked him in the eye when he asked. Despite the silence around him, old man Albert didn't stop paying attention. Each night, when the house went quiet, he sat by the window and reviewed his notes. He compared little Liam's good days and bad days. He noticed that the bad ones always came after the same medication, one with a silver label and a faint blue logo printed on the box. He searched through the trash and found a few discarded boxes with that same logo. The name printed there was North Axis Farmer, a company he didn't recognize at first. When he asked Reginald about it, he sighed heavily. Said North Axis was one of the pharmaceutical companies that had worked on Harriet's treatments years ago. Told him to stop worrying, that these were trusted suppliers. Not Old Man Albert couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Harriet had died despite all those treatments. Now little Liam was suffering too under the same brand name. The connection made him uneasy. He started to wonder if this could really be just another tragedy or something much darker. Reginald was exhausted both mentally and physically. Old Man Albert noticed how his face had grown thinner and his voice had lost strength. He spent hours in his office buried in work or sitting in silence. When Old Man Albert approached him with his notes, he didn't want to listen. "Old Man Albert," he said, rubbing his forehead. "I appreciate how much you care, but you're not a doctor. Dr. Kensington knows what he's doing. Please don't make this harder than it already is." His tone was tired, not angry, but final. Old Man Albert felt a mix of frustration and sadness. He wasn't trying to challenge anyone. He only wanted to protect little Liam, but he could see how far gone Reginald was. Didn't trust anyone, not even himself. He had lost his wife to the same illness, and now his son was slipping away too. It was easier for him to believe in the system, in the science, in the routine. Admitting that something might be wrong meant facing another unbearable truth. Even with Reginald's warning, Old Man Albert couldn't stop himself from investigating. He paid closer attention during deliveries and noticed how often new medicine arrived, even when the old boxes weren't finished. The men who brought them always came late at night, unloading unmarked containers. One evening, Old Man Albert decided to stay awake and watch from the kitchen window. Around midnight, a black van pulled into the driveway. Two men wearing company uniforms carried several boxes inside. He stepped closer and saw the label. Printed clearly on the side, North Axis Farmer. His heart started to race. He remembered that same name from Harriet's records and from the strange boxes in little Liam's room. When he asked one of the maids about it the next morning, the woman shrugged. "We don't question the deliveries," she said softly. "It's all arranged through Mr. Harrington and Dr. Kensington." Old Man Albert nodded, but his mind was spinning. The more he saw, the less sense it made. Something was being hidden, and he didn't know why. That night, Old Man Albert sat alone in his room, staring at the small notebook filled with his notes. The evidence wasn't enough to prove anything, but it was too much to ignore. The medicine, the labels, the reactions, the company, all of it pointed towards something dangerous. He remembered little Liam's weak voice, calling him Albert and asking him to save him. That memory hit him again, harder than before. If he was right, if something wrong was happening, then little Liam wasn't just sick, he was being made worse. Old Man Albert felt a cold fear spread through his chest, but also a strange determination. He didn't know what he could do yet, but he knew he couldn't stay silent. As he turned off the light, the image of the North Axis boxes stayed in his mind. For the first time, the thought became real. What if little Liam's illness wasn't an accident at all, but something caused on purpose? The idea scared him, but it also made him sure he had to find out the truth. Old Man Albert couldn't ignore his suspicions any longer. The strange medication, the unanswered questions, and the name North Axis Farmer kept circling in his mind. He needed help from someone who could look deeper into the hospital's files without raising alarms. That was when he thought of Alfred Brooks, an old friend from his hometown. They had grown up together, but life had taken them in different directions. Alfred had become a hospital manager, known for his honesty and attention to detail. Old Man Albert hadn't spoken to him in years, but he decided to reach out anyway. One morning, while little Liam was resting, he called Alfred and asked if they could meet privately. His voice trembled as he explained the situation. Alfred listened quietly, and though he didn't say much, his tone showed concern. He agreed to help, but warned Old Man Albert to be careful. "If what you're saying is true," Alfred said, "you're touching something very serious." Old Man Albert knew that, but he was ready to take the risk. A few days later, Old Man Albert visited the hospital while little Liam had his regular checkup. Alfred met him in a small office near the administration wing. The room was quiet, the blinds half closed, and the air felt heavy. Alfred had already started digging through some of the hospital's digital records. He showed Old Man Albert a list of prescriptions linked to little Liam's name. Some of them matched what Old Man Albert had written in his notebook, but others didn't. These aren't part of the standard protocol for his diagnosis, Alfred said, frowning. Old Man Albert leaned closer, trying to read the screen. The files were filled with numbers, drug codes, and strange medical terms. But even without full understanding, he could tell something was wrong. Alfred clicked through the files faster, his expression turning serious. "Look at this," he said, opening 2 different patient records. Both had identical test results down to the smallest detail, but with different names. "That's impossible," he whispered. "It means the data was copied or manipulated." He found mismatched lab reports, missing test dates, and duplicated medical charts. Even more alarming, one of the test batches used little Liam's patient ID number. But the sample dates didn't line up with the days he was actually at the hospital. Old Man Albert's stomach turned as he realized what that meant. Someone had switched samples. "Could this just be a mistake?" he asked quietly. Alfred shook his head. "Not this many. This looks intentional." He opened another folder labeled Special Authorizations. Inside were several documents signed under something called Compassionate Treatment Program. Alfred explained that these programs were often used for testing unapproved drugs under special conditions. Old Man Albert's hand started shaking. "Unapproved?" I asked. Alfred nodded slowly. "Experimental, sometimes legal, sometimes not." Then he scrolled down and both men froze when they saw a familiar name. Harriet Harrington. "That's little Liam's mother," Old Man Albert said, barely breathing. Alfred's eyes widened. Then, "This goes back years," as the documents mentioned North Axis Farmer repeatedly, listing drug codes and study references that connected both Harriet and little Liam to the same experimental project. Unfiled, described hereditary treatment continuation, suggesting that little Liam's therapy might have been part of an ongoing study that began with Harriet's case. Old Man Albert's voice broke when he asked, "Are you saying they're still testing on him?" Alfred didn't answer immediately. He turned to another set of files that looked older, marked as archived. After searching through dozens of folders, he found a digital report labeled H. Harrington Trial 02. When he opened it, both men stared in disbelief. It was a record of an experimental drug trial conducted under Harriet's name, complete with medical notes and progress logs. The final page showed a scanned signature from Harriet Harrington, supposedly authorizing the tests. But Alfred frowned. "Old Man Albert," he said softly, "this doesn't match her actual signature style. This looks forged." A forged signature meant Harriet had never agreed to those treatments. It meant someone had used her name and condition to run experiments without consent, and now little Liam was suffering because of it. Alfred continued reading through the contract. It detailed a partnership between the hospital and North Axis Farmer for testing new oncology medications in terminal patients. In theory, it sounded like humanitarian research. But the fine print revealed something disturbing. The company was allowed to continue data collection through family members if genetic similarities were found. Old Man Albert felt sick. That explained why little Liam was being given drugs that didn't match his prescriptions. It wasn't about healing him. It was about studying him. Alfred looked at him speechless. Both men sat in silence for several minutes, trying to process what they had uncovered. For Old Man Albert, the weight of the truth was unbearable. Everything Harriet and little Liam had gone through might have been part of the same cruel experiment, disguised as medical help. By the time Old Man Albert left Alfred's office, his heart felt heavy, but his thoughts were clear. He now understood that this wasn't just about sickness or fate. Harriet and little Liam had been used, manipulated, and betrayed by people they trusted. He thought about Reginald, how broken he already was, and wondered how he would react to this. But most of all, he thought about the promise he had made to little Liam. It was no longer just about keeping him safe or comforting him during treatments. It was about uncovering the truth and making sure those responsible paid for what they had done. As he walked through the hospital hallways, Old Man Albert kept replaying Alfred's words in his head. "Be careful, Old Man Albert. They won't let this go easily." He didn't know what his next step would be. But one thing was certain. He wouldn't stop now. The promise he made that night beside little Liam's bed had taken on a new meaning. It had become a promise of justice. Old Man Albert knew it was time to tell Reginald what he had found. He couldn't keep the information to himself any longer. not when it involved little Liam's life. That morning, while Reginald sat in his office surrounded by paperwork, he walked in holding a small folder. His hands trembled, but his voice stayed calm. "Mr. Harrington," he began, "I need to show you something important." Reginald looked up, tired and distracted, and gestured for him to speak. Old Man Albert laid the documents on his desk, copies of Alfred's findings, the irregular prescriptions, and the files. With Harriet's name, he explained what he and Alfred had discovered about the switched samples and the strange connection to North Axis Farmer. Reginald's face hardened with every word. At first he didn't say anything, then his expression changed from confusion to anger. He pushed the papers away and stood up abruptly. "You're saying I let my wife and my son be used like test subjects?" His voice rose. Old Man Albert tried to calm him, but he was too furious to listen. Reginald's anger wasn't only directed at Old Man Albert. It came from fear, guilt, and exhaustion. "Do you have any idea what you're accusing me of?" he shouted. "I've done everything to help my son. I've spent millions on his care." Old Man Albert tried to explain that he wasn't accusing him, okay? Only trying to protect little Liam, but the words didn't matter. Reginald pressed the intercom and demanded that Dr. Kensington come to his office immediately. Within minutes, the doctor entered calm, as always, adjusting his glasses. Reginald threw the documents across the desk. "Explain this," he said sharply. Dr. Kensington picked up the papers and skimmed through them, his expression unreadable. Then he smiled slightly and looked at Old Man Albert. "I see what's going on here," he said smoothly. "Mr. Albert has misunderstood the data. These are standard clinical reports, and the duplicated results are simple system errors. It happens all the time." His tone was polite but dismissive. "He means well," he added, "but he's out of his depth." "That's not true," he said. Alfred Brooks from the hospital confirmed these inconsistencies himself. Dr. Kensington turned to Reginald, ignoring him completely. "I know Alfred. He's competent, but he's not qualified to interpret this kind of material either. Sometimes administrators see irregularities where there are none. These are sensitive medical trials. Confidential, yes, but nothing illegal." Reginald rubbed his temples, torn between frustration and fatigue. "So, you're saying this is nothing?" Dr. Kensington nodded slowly. "Exactly. Your wife's case was unique, and so is your son's. The treatments are complex, and it's easy for outsiders to misread them. I would advise that Mr. Albert focus on his actual duties." The conversation ended there. Reginald turned to Old Man Albert, his expression cold and embarrassed. "Old Man Albert, I think you've done enough. Don't involve yourself in medical matters again." He tried to protest, but he raised his hand. "Please, I can't deal with this right now." That was it. He had been dismissed. When Old Man Albert left the office, he felt humiliated and powerless. Everything he had risked to uncover the truth had been erased with a few calm words from Dr. Kensington. Alfred tried to reach Reginald later that afternoon, calling his private line, but he refused to take his call. Old Man Albert saw him walk past him in the hallway without saying a word. The silence in the mansion was heavier than ever. He spent the rest of the day by little Liam's side, watching him sleep, thinking about what had happened. Part of him wanted to quit, to leave that house and forget everything. But when he looked at little Liam's pale face, he knew he couldn't. He remembered his small hand clutching his the way he had asked him to save him. Old Man Albert couldn't walk away. He had made a promise, and that promise still held him there, even when everyone else doubted him. He felt trapped, but determined. Something inside him refused to let go of the truth. That night, things took a terrible turn. Anew. Medication had arrived earlier in the evening, another one from North Axis. The nurse followed the usual routine, preparing the injection while Old Man Albert stood nearby. He wanted to stop it, but had no authority to interfere. Within hours, little Liam's breathing became shallow, and his heartbeat grew weak. Panic filled the room. The nurse called for Dr. Kensington while Old Man Albert rushed to hold little Liam in his arms. His body trembled slightly and his small fingers grabbed his sleeve. "Stay with me," he whispered, tears rolling down his face. Dr. Kensington entered moments later, issuing quick orders to stabilize the boy. After several tense minutes, little Liam's condition steadied, but he was still unconscious. Reginald stood frozen at the door, pale and speechless. Old Man Albert could feel his heart pounding as he looked at the machines keeping little Liam alive. He realized then that he couldn't rely on anyone else.
Dad.
Reginald, not the nurses, and definitely not Dr. Kensington. If he wanted to keep his promise, he would have to act alone.
Dad.
Night, after everyone had gone to rest, Old Man Albert sat beside little Liam's bed. The room was dim, the monitors blinking quietly. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and whispered softly, "I'm here, little Liam. I'm not leaving you." His mind was racing. Every warning, every strange label, every false reassurance, all of it pointed to something bigger. He thought about Alfred's words, about the forged signatures, and about the compassionate treatment program. None of it was compassion. It was exploitation. He looked at little Liam's tiny hand resting on the blanket and felt a mix of sadness and anger rise inside him. This little boy had already lost his mother. Now people who should have been protecting him were using him. Old Man Albert clenched his fists. He didn't know how, but he was going to find out who was behind all of this. His promise wasn't just about saving him anymore. It was about stopping whoever was responsible, no matter the cost. By the time the house grew completely silent, Old Man Albert had made his decision. He would continue investigating, even if it meant risking his job or his safety. He knew he was dealing with powerful people, doctors, corporations, maybe even those funding the hospital itself. But he also knew he couldn't trust anyone else to do it. Reginald was too broken to see the truth, and Dr. Kensington was clearly hiding something. Old Man Albert quietly gathered his notes, photocopies, and the small notebook filled with his observations. He slipped them into his bag and took one last look at little Liam sleeping. Peacefully, "I'll fix this," he whispered. As he left his room, he felt a chill run down his back. But he didn't stop. Somewhere deep down, he understood that he was stepping into something dangerous. Still, he had no choice. The promise he made to little Liam was now his only purpose, and he was ready to face anyone who tried to silence him. It was still dark outside when Old Man Albert found himself tidying Reginald's office. He often used the early hours of the morning to move quietly through the house, doing small tasks while everyone slept. The silence helped him think, and tonight his thoughts were heavy. He was polishing dust off the bookshelves when his cloth caught on something. One of the wooden panels near the corner of the room felt loose. Curious, he tapped it, and it moved slightly under his hand. Old Man Albert looked around, then gently pulled it back. Behind it, hidden deep in the wall, was a small metal safe. It had no labels or instructions, just a dial and a keyhole. Old Man Albert didn't know why, but something told him this mattered. Checked the books nearby and searched through the drawers for clues. That's when he noticed an old photo frame sitting on the desk, one he hadn't paid attention to before. Tucked behind the picture was a faded note with 6 numbers written on it. With trembling hands, Old Man Albert turned to the safe and slowly entered the numbers. He heard a quiet click. The door of the safe opened, and inside were neatly stacked papers, some sealed in folders, others loose. Top of them was a small bundle of handwritten letters tied with a ribbon. Old Man Albert reached in carefully. The first papers he looked at were contracts, official documents between the Harrington family and North Axis Farmer. As he scanned through them, his eyes widened. These were agreements for testing experimental treatments, complete with signatures, approval forms, and financial records. Some of the contracts included payments labeled as research support, but it was clear from the language that they were bribes. There were receipts marked with cash transactions and notes about keeping records confidential. Old Man Albert's heart pounded as he realized this was proof, real, undeniable proof that someone had allowed dangerous testing in exchange for money. But it was the stack of letters underneath that made him stop breathing for a moment. The letters were written in a delicate, familiar handwriting. They were from Harriet. Old Man Albert slowly untied the ribbon and read the first one. Harriet talked about her treatments, the fear she had felt, and how the doctors at North Axis had started giving her medications without full explanations. In one letter, she described how her condition didn't seem to match what she had been told. She mentioned hearing staff talk about trials and data, and how she started suspecting that her treatment was not entirely about saving her. As Old Man Albert continued reading, he could see Harriet's thoughts becoming more urgent. In one of the middle letters, Harriet wrote about wanting to tell Reginald, but not knowing how to start. She said she feared he was too involved with the company through donations and support, and she didn't want to accuse him unfairly. Her words were careful, but her fear was clear. She suspected that her illness was being used as a test. Her trust in the system was broken. Old Man Albert reached the final letter written in shaky handwriting. It had been written just days before Harriet died. In it, Harriet admitted she believed she had been part of an experiment and begged whoever found the letter to stop North Axis from continuing. The last lines were written with emotion that bled through the ink. "If I fail," Harriet wrote, "please protect our son from the same fate." Old Man Albert's hands shook as he read those words over and over again. It wasn't just suspicion anymore, Harriet knew. She had tried to warn someone, but the letters had been hidden in the safe, unread, for years. Old Man Albert thought about everything that had happened since he arrived. The medication, little Liam's reactions, the strange behavior of the nurses. It all connected. Now Harriet had known something terrible was happening, and her final request was clear. Protect little Liam. Old Man Albert folded the letter gently, tears filling his eyes. He couldn't imagine the fear Harriet had felt when writing it. Still holding the letter, Old Man Albert stood up and turned toward the door. He was ready to hide the documents again for the time being, maybe talk to Alfred about what he had found. But the moment he turned, he stopped in place. Reginald was standing in the doorway. His face was pale, his eyes locked on his, and he looked confused and tired. For a second, neither of them said anything. He looked down and saw the letters in his hand, then looked at the open safe. Old Man Albert didn't try to explain. He didn't hide what he had found. Reginald stepped into the room slowly, his eyes scanning the documents on the desk, the folders, and the letters. He looked overwhelmed, as if the air had been pulled from the room. Old Man Albert could see it. The shock, the pain, and something else too. Guilt. The past he had tried so hard to bury was now open in front of him, impossible to ignore. Reginald walked over to the desk and picked up one of the letters. His hands were shaking, sat down slowly and read a few lines. Old Man Albert didn't move or speak. He just watched him. After a few minutes, he looked up at him with a face full of confusion and pain. "She never gave me these," he said quietly. "Never saw them." His voice was low, like someone speaking to themselves. Old Man Albert believed him. It wasn't hard to see that he was truly affected. Reginald ran a hand through his hair, then picked up one of the contracts. "Why would you think I wouldn't believe her?" he whispered. Old Man Albert didn't answer. He didn't know the full truth either, but it was clear that Harriet had been scared, and she had been right to be. Reginald sat there reading silently as the reality began to settle in. The company he had trusted, the people he had supported, had used his wife, and now they were using his son. The room felt heavier than ever. Old Man Albert stepped closer and gently placed the last letter, the one about little Liam, in front of Reginald. He looked at it for a long time before picking it up. When he read those final words, "Protect our son from the same fate," his face broke. Old Man Albert had never seen him like that. He wasn't angry or proud. He just looked broken. All the pain he had tried to hide for years came back in that moment. Reginald leaned back in the chair and covered his face with both hands. Old Man Albert stood in silence, giving him space. For the first time, he knew everything. There were no more theories, no more guesses, just the truth, ugly, painful, and real. Harriet had tried to stop it. She had begged for little Liam to be saved. And now Old Man Albert was the one standing there with that responsibility. Reginald slowly lowered his hands and looked at him again. He didn't speak, but the look in his eyes said everything. The past had returned, and now they both had to face it. Reginald was not the same after reading Harriet's letters. The words kept repeating in his mind, especially the final one. "Please protect our son from the same fate." He couldn't ignore it anymore. That same morning, he walked into the hospital and asked to speak with Dr. Kensington. The meeting happened in a private room. Reginald brought a copy of the documents and placed them on the table. "Explain this," he said firmly. Kensington glanced through the pages without much emotion. His expression stayed calm, almost a calm. Then he leaned back in his chair and said, "These papers are not official. If you continue to follow this line, I'll have no choice but to take legal action for defamation, for interfering with treatment, and for putting your son's life at risk." Reginald was stunned. He expected denial, maybe excuses, but not threats. Kensington stood up, straightened his coat, and added, "If you want your son to live, stop digging. Let the doctors do their job." Then he walked out without another word. That same week, strange things began to happen. Old Man Albert noticed a black car parked across the street from the Harrington mansion 2 nights in a row. At first he thought it was just a coincidence, but then he saw the same vehicle following him when he went to the pharmacy. Alfred also received anonymous messages on his phone. Short texts telling him to stop investigating, calling him by name, even mentioning his family. One message read, "This is bigger than you. Stay out." Old Man Albert's heart raced every time he left the house. He tried not to show fear around little Liam, but the feeling of being watched was constant, he told Reginald. And for the first time, he didn't question him. He simply nodded and told the mansion staff to change security protocols. He also sent someone he trusted to check Alfred's house and install cameras. Something serious was going on. Reginald began to understand that this wasn't just a medical cover-up. It was a dangerous operation, and they had already gotten too close to the truth. A few days later, Dr. Kensington informed the family that he wanted to transfer little Liam to a special unit for further care. He said the team there had more experience with advanced cases and that the move was necessary for little Liam's survival. Old Man Albert didn't believe it for a second. He shared his concern with Alfred, who immediately started digging, discovered that the so-called special unit was not part of any public hospital system. It was a private facility run under the name of a research center linked to North Axis Farmer. No patient. Records were accessible, and the place had no public reviews or contact details. Alfred brought the information to Reginald. "If you let them move little Liam," he said, "you may never see him again." That hit Reginald hard. He sat in silence for a long time before finally saying, "They're trying to erase everything." It was at that moment he made a choice. He would protect Old Man Albert. He would protect Alfred. He would protect little Liam no matter what. That night, little Liam had another crisis. His breathing became shallow and his lips turned blue. The nurses rushed in trying to stabilize him. Old Man Albert stayed by his side, holding his hand, refusing to move. Reginald entered the room and stood by the door, frozen as he watched the boy struggling for air. Old Man Albert looked up at him with tears in his eyes and said, "Please, we have to stop the medication. It's making him worse." "You've seen it." Reginald didn't respond right away. He looked at the machines, at the boy gasping for air, and then at the tray of medicine that had just been prepared. Finally, he turned to the nurse and said, "Hold the treatment. No more of it until we understand what's going on." The nurse hesitated, then obeyed. Old Man Albert cried quietly, feeling both relief and fear. It was a small victory, but an important one. Reginald had finally taken a side, and he had chosen to trust him. After the crisis passed and little Liam was stable again, the three of them, Reginald, Old Man Albert, and Alfred, sat in the office to plan their next move. They knew they couldn't wait any longer. Alfred began gathering all the files he could from the hospital system, printing and saving copies to external drives. Old Man Albert organized the letters from Harriet and the contract papers found in the hidden safe. Reginald contacted a lawyer he trusted, someone from outside the city, and explained that they might need legal protection soon. They knew this wouldn't be easy. North Axis had money, influence, and power, but the trio also had something important: the truth. They made a decision to go public, to bring everything to light: legal drug trials, forged signatures, patient abuse, and threats. Old Man Albert felt the weight of what they were doing, but he didn't back down. Reginald was focused and determined. Alfred stayed calm and methodical. Together, they were ready to act, but one thing still stood in their way: time. And little Liam was running out of it. Little Liam's health was getting worse. His energy dropped every day. Even though they stopped the suspicious medication, the damage was already deep. He barely spoke, and most days he slept for hours without waking. Old Man Albert stayed by his side, reading stories, playing soft music, and helping him drink water. Reginald spent more time in the room now, sitting silently, watching his son with a look of guilt and sorrow. Alfred called daily, updating Old Man Albert on every move he made, every file he saved, and every backup he created. But strange calls kept coming. People knocked on his door late at night and walked away before he could answer. Someone even broke into his car, though nothing was stolen. The message was clear: they were being watched closely. Still, none of them stopped. They were closer to the truth than ever before. Old Man Albert looked at little Liam and whispered the same words every night: "Hold on a little longer." Time was running out, but the fight was far from over. With all the evidence gathered, Old Man Albert, Reginald, and Alfred knew it was time to go public. They needed someone who could take the information and expose it to the world. Us. Someone with credibility who couldn't be easily bought or silenced. That's when Alfred suggested Mark Delgado, a well-known investigative journalist who had uncovered several medical and political scandals over the past decade. He had a reputation for going after the truth, no matter the risk. Old Man Albert contacted him first, and after a quick phone call explaining the basics of what they had, Mark agreed to meet them in a discreet location. The meeting happened in a small, quiet cafe far from the hospital or Harrington mansion. They brought everything: the printed emails, photocopied contracts, screenshots of altered test results, and most importantly, Harriet's final letter. Mark read in silence, occasionally asking a question or scribbling something in his notebook. When he finished, he looked at them and said, "This is going to be big, but you need to be ready. It won't be quiet." He contacted a few sources inside the hospital, cross-referenced internal data with what Alfred had saved, and verified the authenticity of the letters. Then, without warning, he released the first part of the story on his website and social media. The headline read, "Hidden Trials: How North Axis Farmer Used Wealthy Patients as Test Subjects." The article included redacted versions of the contracts, names of doctors involved, and photos of Harriet's letter. Within hours, the story went viral. News outlets picked it up, and social media exploded with outrage. People wanted answers. The hospital released a brief statement denying everything, but it wasn't enough. More reporters began digging. Old Man Albert's phone didn't stop ringing. Alfred's inbox filled with requests from other journalists. Reginald watched the chaos unfold, but didn't speak much. He knew what was coming. He also knew it was necessary. The truth was finally out, and there was no turning back. The exposure had immediate consequences. One day after the article was published, Dr. Kensington tried to flee the country. Airport security flagged his name after a federal order was placed on travel watch lists. He was stopped before boarding a private flight and taken into custody. When searched, he was found carrying several vials of unregistered medication and digital files hidden in encrypted drives. Investigators also discovered contracts linking him directly to North Axis Farmer, showing that he was not just a consultant, but an active partner in several of their unapproved trials. The evidence included payments marked as research bonuses and internal memos discussing test results and patient profiles. His arrest made headlines instantly. Old Man Albert and Alfred watched the news, shocked by how fast things were moving. Reginald sat quietly, holding one of Harriet's letters in his hand. "She tried to warn us," he whispered. For Old Man Albert, it was a small victory. One of the people responsible was finally facing justice. But the fight was not over yet. 2 days later, federal prosecutors entered the hospital with a court order. They moved quickly, sealing off sections of the building and collecting every computer, medical file, and prescription record. Patients were safely relocated to other facilities and families were informed of the investigation. Doctors and nurses were questioned, some suspended, others placed under review. Alfred stayed in touch with his co-workers and sent updates to Old Man Albert as the investigation progressed. More disturbing information came to light. Dozens of wealthy patients over the last 6 years had been unknowingly placed into unauthorized drug trials. Some of them had died without understanding what was really happening to them. Others had survived but suffered permanent damage. Old Man Albert felt sick reading those reports. What happened to little Liam and Harriet was not an isolated case. It was part of a larger pattern, carefully hidden behind medical terms and fake approvals. The public reaction was fierce. Protests formed outside the hospital. News stations ran constant updates. The story had become a national scandal. Back at the Harrington mansion, the atmosphere had completely changed. What was once a place of silence and sadness had turned into the center of a media storm. Reporters camped outside the gates. Cameras pointed toward the house at all hours. News vans lined the street and drones hovered overhead trying to get pictures. Reginald's legal team advised him to stay quiet and keep the family out of the spotlight, but he refused. For years, he had hidden from the world, drowning in guilt and grief. Now he chose to do the opposite. He stood by the front gate with Old Man Albert on one side and little Liam in a wheelchair beside him. Flashing cameras lit up the yard. Microphones were pushed toward his face. Reginald spoke calmly and clearly. "My family was used and lied to," he said. "My wife deserved better. My son deserves better. I will not rest until those responsible are held accountable, and until my son receives the care he truly needs." He was no longer just the butler. He had become a protector, a truth seeker, and someone who refused to back down. Little Liam sat quietly, a blanket over his legs, weak but alert. He looked around at the people, the cameras, the flashes, but he didn't cry. He just held Old Man Albert's hand tightly. The moment was emotional, but it was also powerful. It was the first time the public saw Reginald Harrington, not as a distant billionaire, but as a father fighting for his child. The media quickly picked up the speech. It was broadcast across the country. Talk shows and radio hosts debated the case. People sent messages of support. Donations began pouring in to support legal actions against North Axis. Behind the scenes, Old Man Albert, Alfred, and Reginald continued collecting everything they had, preparing for trial. But in that one moment, as they stood united outside the mansion, they had already won something important. The world was watching now, and hiding the truth was no longer an option. Away from the influence of North Axis farmer and the people who had caused so much harm, little Liam was transferred to a new medical facility. This time, the choice was made carefully. Alfred helped find a small, independent clinic known for its transparency and ethical work. The doctors there had no ties to pharmaceutical companies and agreed to review little Liam's case from the beginning. Reginald was involved in every decision. He sat through the consultations, asked questions, and insisted that nothing be hidden from him again. Old Man Albert went with little Liam in the ambulance, holding his hand the entire way. When they arrived, the new doctors immediately ran a series of tests. Within days, they confirmed what Old Man Albert and Alfred had suspected. The previous medication had worsened little Liam's condition. The treatments from North Axis were not only unnecessary, they were harmful. Now, for the first time, little Liam was going to receive proper care based on honest medical analysis. It wasn't a miracle solution, but it was finally the right path. The new treatment plan was different from anything before. It focused on little Liam's specific condition without relying on experimental or unapproved drugs. The doctors carefully balanced his medication, nutrition, and rest. He started physical therapy to regain strength and was monitored closely for side effects. Old Man Albert stayed with him every day, helping the nurses, learning from the doctors, and making sure little Liam felt safe. Reginald visited daily as well, sometimes staying for hours. He no longer stayed in the background. He sat beside little Liam, read him books, and listened when the boy wanted to talk. Alfred visited on weekends, bringing files related to their ongoing legal work, but also stopping by to see how little Liam was doing. Slowly, something started to change. After just a few weeks, little Liam's body began to respond. He stopped vomiting. His energy returned in short bursts, and he started eating more. One morning, he laughed at a joke Old Man Albert made during breakfast. It was the first real laugh in months. At the mansion, the atmosphere was completely different. When little Liam was well enough to return home part-time, the staff made changes to make him feel more comfortable. Softer lighting, colorful decorations, and new toys. Reginald ordered a small playroom to be set up just for him. Old Man Albert helped decorate it with drawings and storybooks. The once cold, silent house slowly became warm again. Little Liam's laughter was now a regular sound in the hallways. He wasn't fully healed, but the improvement was real and noticeable. Even the nurses who visited for follow-ups commented on how different he looked. Reginald no longer hid in his office. He worked from the living room to stay close to little Liam. He took calls from lawyers, medical professionals, and news reporters. But he always stopped to help Old Man Albert when he needed him. He apologized to him once, not with a long speech, just a quiet, "Thank you for not giving up." Old Man Albert smiled and said, "I made him a promise." That was all he needed to say. Inspired by everything they had learned, Reginald decided to take action beyond his own family. He started a new foundation to help other victims of medical fraud. With Alfred's help, he created a support fund for families who had been misled by fake trials or unsafe treatments. The organization also offered legal aid, medical second opinions, and therapy services for those affected by trauma. Reginald used his wealth not just as a donation, but as a tool for real change. Alfred coordinated the legal side, working with lawyers and investigators. Old Man Albert gave input as well, especially when it came to emotional support and patient care. He had lived through the pain and fear. His voice brought humanity to the project. The foundation received public support quickly. After the North Axis scandal, many people were eager to back something that truly protected patients. For Reginald, this wasn't about image. It was about making sure no one else had to go through what his wife and son did. As little Liam grew stronger, his personality began to shine through more. He asked more questions, played for longer periods, and even started learning to read basic words. With Old Man Albert's help, he taught him with patience and joy, always celebrating even the smallest progress. Reginald often joined them during these sessions. Sometimes he helped, other times he simply watched and smiled. The bond between them was stronger now. They were not just a family on paper. They were a real family, built through struggle and love. Old Man Albert still kept a quiet routine, waking early and making sure everything was ready for little Liam's needs. But there was peace in his movements now. He was no longer just reacting to problems. He was helping build a future. Alfred visited often, not just as a professional partner, but as a friend. They all had found something they didn't expect during this battle: connection, healing, and purpose. The pain hadn't disappeared, but it no longer controlled everything. The Harrington mansion, once filled with silence and tension, was now filled with life. There were still hard days, especially when little Liam had setbacks, but they no longer faced them alone or without answers. There was a sense of control, of trust. Old Man Albert would walk through the hallways and hear little Liam's voice coming from the playroom or the kitchen. Sometimes it was laughter. Other times it was his soft voice calling his name. Reginald, too, was different, less distant, more involved, and more open with his emotions. They still kept Harriet's memory alive, especially for little Liam, who often asked questions about his mother. Old Man Albert and Reginald answered with honesty and care, showing him pictures and sharing stories. But now those conversations weren't only sad, they were filled with love and hope. For the first time in a long time, hope didn't feel fake. It was real. It had been built through action, through truth, and through people who chose to fight, not with money or power, but with heart. Months had passed since the chaos, the legal battles, and the painful discoveries. Life had slowly taken on a new rhythm. On a sunny afternoon, little Liam was running through the garden behind the Harrington mansion. His steps were quick and light. His laughter filled the air, and his energy showed how far he had come. He wasn't just better, he was thriving. The boy who had once spent most of his days hooked to machines was now chasing butterflies and calling Old Man Albert to come watch. Reginald sat on a bench nearby, watching closely. He didn't look away, not even for a second. Old Man Albert stood under the shade of a tree, smiling at the scene in front of him. He'd seen him at his weakest, carried him through the worst, and now seeing him run again was something he had once feared might never happen. Alfred arrived minutes later, waving from the garden gate. Everything felt different now. Life had been rebuilt, not perfectly but honestly, and that made it strong. The North Axis case had become a global headline. Investigations had expanded into other countries. Former executives were being charged. Whistleblowers from different institutions came forward, exposing a long list of hidden experiments, patient manipulation, and unethical trials. The scandal was used in conferences, legal seminars, and medical schools as a turning point in the conversation about ethical standards. News outlets followed the updates regularly. Reginald gave interviews not to seek sympathy or to clear his name, but to make sure the truth stayed in the spotlight. Alfred worked closely with journalists, lawyers, and lawmakers, helping create guidelines to avoid future abuses. But the biggest step came when they announced the creation of a new foundation, the Harriet Harrington Institute for Ethical Research. It would focus on transparency in clinical trials, support for families affected by medical fraud, and education for future health professionals. The inauguration event was planned for months, and it finally happened on a day filled with calm skies and quiet excitement. The ceremony was held in a modest but beautiful auditorium, built with donations from people who had followed the story. Attendees included doctors, journalists, survivors, families, and even students. Reginald stood on stage holding a folder with a few of Harriet's letters inside. His hands didn't shake, but his voice was heavy with emotion. He shared parts of Harriet's words, Not the ones about pain, but the ones where she spoke about her hopes for little Liam, and her belief that science should always serve life, not business. The room listened in silence. Then Reginald turned to Old Man Albert, who stood a few steps behind him, holding little Liam's hand. "There was a time when I almost lost my son," he said. "Once to illness and once to my own blindness. But Old Man Albert never gave up on him. He saved him, not just with care, but with courage." People stood and clapped. Loud Old Man Albert felt overwhelmed, not by the attention, but by the truth in Reginald's words. He hadn't done it for praise, did it for little Liam. After the applause died down, Reginald gestured to little Liam, who walked up slowly to the microphone. He was wearing a small suit and looked slightly nervous. But when he smiled, the entire audience smiled with him. "He promised he would save me," he said clearly. And he did. The crowd clapped again, louder this time. Old Man Albert walked over to him and hugged him tightly. His eyes were full of tears, but it wasn't sadness. It was something deeper. It was relief, joy, and pride all mixed together. In that moment, everything they had been through flashed in his mind. The hospital nights, the arguments, the threats, the secrets, and the fear. But it had all led to this. Looked at Reginald, then at Alfred, and then at the crowd. They weren't just honoring a woman who had passed, were continuing what she had tried to start. Were doing it in her name. And that meant something real, something lasting. The rest of the event was filled with stories, shared memories, and plans for the future. People came up to Old Man Albert to thank him. Some were families who had experienced similar tragedies. Others were professionals who had learned from the case and changed how they worked. Alfred gave a short speech about the importance of fighting for transparency. Reginald answered questions from the press, but the most important moment came afterward, when the three of them, Old Man Albert, Reginald, and Alfred, stood outside the building, watching little Liam play with a group of children. The sound of his laughter no longer reminded them of what they had lost. It reminded them of what they had saved. Old Man Albert sat down on a bench, tired but happy. Reginald joined him. "She would be proud of this," he said quietly. Old Man Albert nodded. "I think she already is." There was no more anger, no more hiding, just quiet understanding between people who had faced darkness and chosen to build something better. Instead, that evening, they returned to the mansion. It no longer felt like a museum of grief. The pictures of Harriet on the walls were still there, but now they brought comfort instead of pain. The staff smiled more. The air felt lighter. Little Liam walked through the hallways confidently, pointing at drawings he had made or calling Old Man Albert to look at something he'd built. He followed him with a calm heart. Reginald stood by the window for a moment, looking out at the yard where his son had once fought to stay alive. Alfred sat at the dining table reviewing plans. For upcoming programs under the foundation, they weren't just a group of people connected by tragedy anymore. They had become something stronger, a family, not built by blood, but by choices. Choices to fight, to care, to believe, and to stay when it would have been easier to walk away. For the first time in a long time, there was peace, real peace. And with it, a future they could finally believe in. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Till next time.